And on GoToMeeting, please be sure that everything is muted, both the sound and the video. And use the chat box to communicate and ask questions, but please make sure that you're sending the message only to the organizer. And I'm happy to introduce our brown bag speaker for today, Lauren Leigh Kelly. Lauren is an assistant professor of urban teacher education at the Rutgers Graduate School of Education. She received her bachelor's degree in English from Wesleyan University. Her master's is in adolescent education from St. John's University, and her doctorate in English education from Teachers College, Columbia. Before coming to Rutgers, Lauren was a postdoctoral research fellow at Boston University. She taught in the English department at Medgar Evers College, the City University of New York, and Five Towns College, and taught in the English education program at Teachers College, Columbia University. Lauren also taught high school English for 10 years in New York. And her topic for today is developing critical consciousness in secondary schools. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, no, you can take it. Hi, everyone who's watching. I'm going to turn off this camera, yes, if that's okay, in a moment, but hi and welcome and enjoy. And I guess this button. Yep. Anything else? That's it?
No.
Cool. Nice. Good afternoon, everyone. I know it's still technically morning, but I think we're closer to the afternoon. If you've been up for most of the day, as many of us have, it feels like it should be afternoon by now. So thank you for being here. Please get food, settle in, get comfortable. Feel free to get closer. I see some folks are in the corners. If you have to slip out at any point, absolutely fine. I know we have busy schedules, especially this month. So I, yes, come from the field of English education. Specifically, I taught high school English in 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, including electives. If you're familiar with my work at all, I typically tend to talk about hip-hop literacies and critical hip-hop literacies, but that is not what we're talking about today. So you're in for something a little new and different. So the work I want to share with you comes from a research study I was involved in with some folks at Boston University. And we were looking at the development of critical consciousness in high school students. And so what they did for this study was follow a group of 9th graders through from the beginning of their 9th grade year in these high schools through graduation. And actually this year, now that most of them are in college, we'll be doing some follow-up interviews and surveys to really look at what does this work look like over time. And that's something that really differentiates this work from other studies on critical consciousness is the longevity, right? That we're looking at that development from these multiple lenses, looking at what are they already starting with, right? How do they come into 9th grade thinking about issues of equity, social issues specifically involving race and class equity? And then what are they consuming in addition to what they're learning throughout high school? What are they leaving with? And then what are they doing with that? So it's a lot of questions we looked at. And the work that I did was specifically in 2 high schools, both urban charter high schools whose missions were specifically dedicated to social justice, to engaging young people in discussions and also actions involving social change. And so I was in these schools for a few days a week, every week, for the students' 12th grade year. And I was looking at the 12th grade classes, also some of the 10th and 11th grade classes to see what did they learn before, right? So I came to the study a little bit later, not in the 1st or 2nd or 3rd year, but in their 4th year. And so I wanted to know, how did they get here, right? Some of the things I was seeing in these classrooms were so mature and so sophisticated. And so I wanted to know like, what had to be taught beforehand? And so I looked at some of the other classes to see what those structures were that they built in. In addition to being in the classes, I was also talking to the teachers, looking at the schedules, emailing with the teachers and students, reading their work, and really just collecting as much data as I could to find out what does this work look like. And I think it's really important to think about the day-to-day practices that lead to the development of critical consciousness, because especially as a school of ed that is devoted to social justice, right? And teaching about social justice as an idea, it sounds wonderful, right? And important and great, but it's a different story to think about what does that look like, right? What does a worksheet look like when we're talking about equity and social justice? What kind of readings are we dealing with? What do assignments look like? And so it really gave me the opportunity to see that work from Monday through Friday, to see what homework looks like in this field. What are teachers doing? And then what can we, as students, as teachers, as educators do to really promote this work and develop it? So firstly, critical consciousness is described by Ferry as the quest for human completion. It involves developing tools to analyze and transform the world through social action, and is brought about not through an intellectual effort alone, but also through praxis, right? Through the authentic union, Ferry says, of action and reflection. It's really important to think about the interplay between the two, right? The critical consciousness, well, it seems like it's about thought, right? We think about consciousness as something that happens just mentally, right, up here, but that thought alone only does so much without action, right? If there isn't action behind it, you're just sitting with those thoughts, right? And then how do we spread them? How do we turn that into transformation? Simultaneously, action alone without thought also is sort of short-sighted, right? That there needs to be some thought behind it. We've had a lot of conversations in our research group about, well, what if someone joins a protest because their sister's in the protest, right? And they're just hanging out with their sister that day, right? If they're not really thinking about why they're there, they haven't doing the readings behind it, they're just sort of hanging out that day in the protest, is that a form of action, right? And so we looked at those different layers of action, and then does one come, the chicken or the egg argument, right? Does one come before the other? Do you have to first be doing these readings and having these conversations, have this critical reflection before you engage in action? Or do you first have to have that contact, right? Do you have to have those moments, that community around you, to then go back and think? And what we've come to, what Ferry talks about a lot, is that it's simultaneous, right? It isn't necessarily one before the other, but they're both happening and they're both developing over time. So as I mentioned, these were in charter schools specifically dedicated to civic engagement, right? Social justice is a part of their missions. If you go to their websites, they talk about. The hallways are covered, right, with ideas, promotion about social change and transformation. There were roughly 400 students in this particular school, grades 9 through 12, almost all students of color, and 73% free and reduced lunch. And what we're going to look at for today, because this is a really large study, is just one specific school involved in this study. And in that school, I was looking at their 11th and 12th grade English classes, a class called Sociology and Activism that all the 12th graders had to take. So it was a mandatory sort of core course, and a project that we'll talk about associated with that class that they had to complete in order to graduate, or as one of their graduation requirements. Also a 12th grade US government class. And I was looking at the teaching and learning processes that were happening there. So I wasn't focused on grades, their test scores, right, the academic achievement part, but just what's happening in these classrooms, and connected to that, what's happening at home in terms of homework, in terms of readings that they bring into these classrooms. So in addition to conducting these ethnographic observations in the high school, I was also interviewing teachers, right, the teachers whose classes I was observing, also interviewing students, looking at the student work, and again, curricular materials, so things that were passed out. Some of the teachers were really preemptive. When they knew I was coming in, they would pre-send me the materials and say, okay, if you want to catch up, we're reading chapters 1 through 10 of this book. It really sort of brought me back into the idea of being a high school student and how much work there is, right? To sit in these classrooms and see what they had to do between Monday and Tuesday. And I was barely able to keep up with that, right? And that was just 2 classes, right, at a time I was observing. And the students also had math and science on top of that. And so to analyze that, I was looking at critical pedagogical practices. So what are these teachers doing that could be considered a part of critical pedagogy? Critical literacy practices, especially in those English courses. So how are they reading these texts critically, right? Not just for the devices, but also for identities, right? Social issues that are reflected in these texts. Looking at the socio-political development, and I saw that really across the board, but especially in that sociology and change class, right? How they were thinking about looking at understanding and asking questions about these social issues, right? And then how they developed specifically through that contact, right? And then through sociocultural learning theories, how are these young people involved in activism, right? Or forms or stages of activism. And I want to know, as I mentioned, how do these schools teach students about systems of oppression, right? It's a really broad concept and really complex. And how do you work with adolescents, right, with teenagers on understanding that? What language specifically is used in these classrooms to discuss ideas about power and equity? And again, from my background as, I call myself like a pseudo-linguist, because I'm always fascinated by the power of language and how we use that in the classroom. And I found, in teaching high school, sometimes if you just mention the word race or any sort of racial term, automatically it's seen as racist, right? So if you just bring up one word that deals with race, all of a sudden it's like the racist lesson, right? Or a racist teacher. And so thinking about how do we understand language, right? That race and racial and racism are all very different things, right? How are students in these schools exposed to ideas of social activism? And again, even before being involved, how do they just learn about it, right? What is social activism? How do you differentiate between maybe going to a shelter and handing out coats, starting the drive to collect the coats? creating blogs or literature about why we need to do outreach, difference between outreach and activism, so really working through those terms, and to what extent do students in these schools feel empowered to create change. Oftentimes we can sort of get students to the point where they're understanding things are not awesome everywhere, right? Like there are problems, and then we leave them there, right? So how do you sort of engage them in moving towards change, right? And that empowerment that you can do something about the problems, right? Going beyond, I'm just a kid, I'm just a teenager, what can I do? And so what I found was, and we're looking at very broad categories here, but to try to pare it down a little bit, looking at how critical theory and connected to that critical language was really important in bringing about this critical consciousness that we talk about, right? That having a theory, having the language is a very important part of having those discussions, the writing and the activism, exposure to counter narratives, right, or counter storytelling in these classes. And then, and I'll detail these later, but critical classroom practices. So classroom practices that go beyond a do now and an exit ticket, or generally having discussions, right? But the critical part of that that brings about that consciousness. And so, I'm probably blocking some people here. In these classes, in the English classes and also in the sociology classes, they looked very specifically at theory. And coming from a literary background, exposing students to literary theory is usually part of our practice. But the ways in which this happened in the classes were beyond sort of just looking at psychological theory, or just looking at reader response, but looking at trauma theory, right? And so these students were really deeply investigating and understanding how trauma can be passed down, right? It can be passed down through generations, right? Even if you did not experience something yourself. And they read this in connection to texts that they were reading. They also looked at feminist theory, they looked at queer theory, and it wasn't just a simple definition, right? Like write on your note card what queer theory is and move on, but they were really reading articles, reading chapters in these texts, really understanding the language associated and then the different the structures and the layers of these theories. And then so when we see the critical language connected to that and coming into play is, again, how they're receiving the critical language, using it, right, and understanding it, and then where we see it coming back through in their writing. And so on the top left, you'll see a do now assignment. So the students had already been exposed to language of post-colonial theory. And so they were asked in this do now to recall, how do you understand othering? How do you understand subaltern or colonized subject? And I was there on that day. And again, this is a do now assignment. This is a review thing, right? This was 5 minutes that it happened. And the students were not only able to connect these terms to what they were reading, which was Sherman Alexie at the time, I think Tamil Indians, but they were also connecting it to what they saw in the world, right? They're connecting it to their own lives. And then on the right, you see they're looking at feminist theory, and so these definitions of misogyny, kind of criticism, again, really critical language they're looking at. I don't know if you could see on the bottom right, it's really bright, but it says biological model and linguistic model. And then on the left, this is a student's extended paragraph where they're connecting these texts or looking at Top Dog, Underdog, where the main protagonists are Booth and Lincoln, and using the language of queer theory to understand their role as protagonists, as males in the story, to look at power and language. So here they talk about compulsory heterosexuality and biological essentialism. And I won't say that everyone understood these terms fully and they could all write theses on them, but they had some working knowledge that this was a thing, right? And it was connected to power, and it was connected to equity, and it's connected to identity, and they were seeing it in these texts. So something really important I found, especially in one of these English classes, was the use of counter narratives. And what I found were literary texts that are not mainstream, with the exception of Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. I had never seen any of these other texts taught in sort of a mainstream English classroom, right? The first one is M. Butterfly, which is a play about, I don't know if you all have heard this story, a spy who lived, not fully lived, but in some ways lived life as a woman and then was involved in a romantic encounter with someone who worked for the government. And that took place in Vietnam and then also parts in France. Kiss of a Spider Woman takes place in Argentina. Someone who's a political prisoner. Tamil Indians, Sherman Alexie, looking at sort of indigenous and Native American cultures. And then Top Dog, Underdog, and Stigmata, they're kind of dark here, were used in the same units where they were studying trauma theory. And in both of those texts, the students were looking at how physical things can be passed down. So in Stigmata, a young woman who's 15 inherits a quilt from her family. It was like her great-great-great-great-great-grandmother's quilt. And each generation, people had sewn things into the quilt, right? They were passing down this story. And And then she's just having flashbacks to things that occurred way before she was born. So she has flashbacks to being in Africa pre-transatlantic slave trade. She has flashbacks to being on a ship during the Middle Passage. And so she carries with her the history of her family, right? Both in her mind, but also physically with quilts. And then Top Dog, Underdog, these two brothers inherit physical objects, but also this pain and this trauma from their parents. And so all these texts that were brought in, again, with the exception of Tim O'Brien, they were not available on book rags, Schmoop, Spark Notes, Cliff Notes. And so the students had to read them, right? They had no choice. If they wanted to do well in class, they had to read them. And so just that alone, bringing in these sort of marginalized texts, not only expose students to other perspectives, right? All of these things, there's a global perspective, right? Multiple identities, whether it's sexual identities, cultural identities, linguistic identities, political identities, but they also were forced to really engage with these texts, right? And not just sort of get stuff from the internet and get by. So in terms of the critical classroom practices, of course, annotating texts, right? That's a requirement typically in any sort of literature class. And oftentimes they were given the text to keep. So with Top Dog, Underdog, with M. Butterfly, they had their own and they were able to write in it. Relying on textual evidence to support claims, right? No one was ever allowed in these classes to make a statement without having a page number or a quote or an example. Respectfully listening to and challenging each other's ideas. And so going back to the earlier grade levels that I observed, when I saw that was involved in Socratic seminars, I could see those building blocks of how they got to the point in 12th grade where they're able to have these really organic, sophisticated conversations. And so at the 9th and 10th grade level, it was, I think this, I see this, I see this, and very little interplay between people's comments, right? And then 11th, 12th grade, they're saying, I would like to add on to what Anthony said by saying this, or I agree with Brandon, however, right? So they're able to use that language of Socratic dialogue to engage with these texts. And in such a way, the teacher was just sort of in the corner of the room marking down that people were talking, but did not have to interject that much, right? Because they'd learned how to do this. And then for the discussions, again, they weren't just sort of coming to the classroom and superficially talking about the text, but there were a lot of assignments built into these classes where they had to go home and review their notes, pre-read some articles, right? Watch videos that were connected to whatever this unit was. Oftentimes finding their evidence and their claims already, so they would come into the classroom and be prepared to be in dialogue. And again, this did not happen overnight, right? These are 11th and 12th graders I'm watching, so this is over the course of time they learn these strategies. So this is one example. This is in the US government class to prepare for this seminar. And by the way, this class only happens once a week. And so they had to do a lot of work at home to prepare. So that they would come in ready. There was not time for them to be reviewing or reading things. They would come in and be ready to talk. And the whole class was dedicated to them having these conversations. And so to prepare for this question about the regulation of US immigration, they were given a series of articles that they were asked to read. And the question or the task was read, listen, analyze the provided sources and any others that you find. So they were encouraged to also do more digging, right? And some of them did. And compose a thorough but concise post. So they're posting these things online, reading each other's to address the questions of, is the process of gaining entry into and or a work visa in and or citizenship of the US too easy or difficult? Why or why not? Is illegal immigration hurting the US economy? How should the US government regulate immigration? So really complicated, sophisticated conversations for these seniors to have, but to engage them in these very current social issues. And then all this preparation went into them being able to come in and have a dialogue where they knew things, right? There's another example. This comes from an English class where they were about to read a graphic novel called Sexile. And it's about a Cuban immigrant who identified as transgendered and did not feel comfortable in his home and his community, and then moved to the United States. And so the pre-reading, they watched videos about the Mariel boat lift that happened in the 1980s, right, in Cuba. And also read a series of articles. And then were asked, after consuming all of that, and this was all at home and a little bit during class, based on these articles and videos, what was life like for poor LGBT plus people? How might they have felt about the boat lift, right? And so here we have this, of course, developing empathy, right? How might they have felt? Based on what you've read, what do you understand about these identities, right? Also looking at these intersectional identities, right? That you're looking at an immigrant experience, right? A cultural experience, also a sexual identity. And then they came into the classroom ready to have this conversation and then start reading this text, right? This is all before the text as a way to engage with it more critically. And so let's look at some of the annotations. this comes from students' text, Top Dog Underdog. Again, these were theirs. So they were allowed to write in this. This is not a violation. And here you have the student wrote, kind of hard to see the handwriting, crab bucket effect, right? So they've already been exposed to the idea of crabs in a bucket or crabs in a barrel, right? Sort of climbing over each other and not getting anywhere, and then connecting it to this text. This next one also comes from Top Dog Underdog. At the end of a scene, this student wrote traumatic reenactment, right? And that comes from the psychological or the trauma theory. They've learned about how people can, in their actions, reenact something that was traumatic and not even realize it, right? Anyone got caught up in watching that Jessica Biel show this summer, The Sinner, right? No, I don't want to give anything away. But let's just say traumatic reenactment is in there, right? And so understanding through the lens of this text, right, through literature, how this happens in life. Then this last one comes from a student annotation of M. Butterfly. And this is where they looked at queer theory and feminist theory. And so notice a lot of her annotations are specifically about gender and power, right? She wrote objectification / sexualization of women. Down here at the bottom, the women are forced to have sex even without their permission. And then on the side, submissive to men, right? And so they're reading these texts and already sort of looking for where they see these issues of power or equity through the lens of the language that they've been exposed to, right, and studying. So during class discussion, and these are just a few excerpts to see what are they saying, like how are they engaging with these ideas out loud. They've read Indian Camp and Three Shots, and this is actually Ernest Hemingway they've been reading. And Elijah said, depending on who the person is or wants to be, gender is performative due to yesterday's reading, because as we read, his father told him that he hates gay people, and he doesn't want his father to hate him, so he basically hides his emotions. And again, this was just a class response. This is not an essay. This is not a written piece. This is, as they're talking about this text, connecting what they've been learning, right? Connecting that language. The idea of gender as being performative can be a new thing, right? That's not sort of standard mainstream English education, right? In another English class, they were reading Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. Not the entire thing, but I think the first half. They read a lot this year. And Rachel said, my evidence, because she made a claim, she said, my evidence is on the first page of the foreword. Reads the quote. I feel like this foreword, I like the symbolism they use of sleepwalking. I always say when something is invisible, it's the most dangerous, like patriarchy. I like how she uses the symbolism of sleepwalking. You're just going by it. You're not really seeing reality. And this is a term, I'm pretty sure I'd never heard of or used the term patriarchy until well into college, right? But they've been exposed to this language to have these conversations, right? That there's a way that they're able to access these critical discussions through that language, that everyone at this point knew what she meant when she said this. And then this last example comes from, there's a class where they specifically were focusing on post-colonial literature and the post-colonial perspectives. They read Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. I do want to point out that during this unit, I walked into the classroom one day and there was a student in the back of the room doing one of these super excited things. And he said, are we going to talk about the book today? And I stopped for a moment and had to figure out if he's being sarcastic or not. Because again, having been a high school English teacher, that's usually not something someone says unless they're being sarcastic. But he meant it. He came into the room really excited to talk about this book because of the lens through which they're viewing it, right? I remember reading Heart of Darkness in high school and I hated it. I don't know what was going on. But because they're reading it through the lens of culture, right? Looking at colonization as sort of this project, they were excited to engage in these discussions. So as we were reading, Issa said, Africa didn't need the colonization. If you go back to the quote that we discussed, Marlowe himself is saying how interfering in general with the natives and their whole lifestyle was ugly in a way. And then reads a quote from the text. Pretty much he himself has noticed that his whole colonization stuff hasn't been working out in a good way. So it's unnecessary for them to interfere with their lifestyle, right? Really complex ideas that they're engaging with. And again, because they're asked to, right? That this was put on the table as something they should be talking about. They're not just reading for devices, not just reading for symbolism or poetic effects, but using those literary devices to really understand what's happening culturally, right? What's happening structurally, right? And historically. And this is the last essay excerpt I'll read for you. So this comes from an essay in which this student talked about Top Dog Underdog, and stigmata. Again, those are the texts where they're looking at trauma theory, right, and what's being passed down. But you'll notice the student doesn't just stop at looking at trauma theory, but is really pulling all of these ideas together, right, using all this language. And I'll warn you, it's kind of dense. I'll read slowly. The play Top Dog Underdog by Susan Laurie Parks and the novel Stigmata by Phyllis Alicia Perry are two works of literature that symbolically epitomize the impacts of reliving past traumas. Parks historically encapsulates the confluence of systemic racism, economic degradation, and definitions of masculinity. By the way, I underlined these things. The student didn't underline. This is for emphasis. I did that. Illustrated through the brothers' desperate attempt to live week after week off of the little money they depend on for their survival and the elevation of their machismo. Perry revisits the horrors of slavery through a young female who is almost coerced into acknowledging her visions as mental instability, to give voice to Black women who are still silenced and underprivileged today, due to their powerless intersectional identities even after slavery times. Through the direct link of history and human identity, and through the physical and mental experiences of the brutal reality of the slave trade, both Parks and Perry symbolically reveal how the traumatic events of the barbaric enslavement of Africans continue to perpetuate the disadvantages and injustices African Americans have yet to break free and heal from within their families and communities. That was paragraph 1 of the whole essay. So the student does go on to unpack a lot of this very dense language. But again, to see it, there's an understanding that all these things don't exist just independently, right? It's not just about classism, right, or economic degradation, or just about systemic racism, or just about masculinity, but all these things, right? This word confluence, right? All these things are working together simultaneously, both in the text and in the world. And so I mentioned I was also looking for sort of socio-political development, right? How are these students really thinking, beyond the text themselves about what's happening in the world through these lenses? And so if it's okay, I'd like to read for you a moment of my observation notes. I was in the college office one day typing up my notes from the last class, and there was a group of young women behind me just having a casual conversation. I think they're doing homework or they're working on things. And they weren't with the teacher. There was a college counselor in the sort of the corner doing work, but they weren't in class, right? They weren't in session or in extra help. They were just casually talking to each other. So I wrote, as I type these notes, I overhear a conversation about intersectionality in the college office. One student is writing about Kimberly Crenshaw. She's a bit confused about the concept. One student explains to her that intersectionality means overlapping identities, for example, being Black and female. She says that it's usually focused on race and gender. I'm a bit nosy, so I enter the conversation and ask them why intersectionality is important. It's the teacher in me, I can't help it. The student who first asked the question struggles for a bit. She explains that it's about layered identities, and I ask the question again. A student gives the example that Hillary Clinton can connect to the experience of being female, but not Black and female. I should say this is happening post-election, right? So that was still on their minds. And I asked, why does that matter? Can a group not meet the needs of all of its members because they're not recognizing all of their identities? Yes, they agree. Another student interjects the idea of collective identity, which they learned in the sociology course. I asked, so does collective identity overshadow intersectional identities? It shouldn't, she said, but it does. And so what I noticed here, beyond just how much I interject in young people's conversations, is that they were, and again, this is independent of class, they were just on their own sitting with these ideas from multiple courses, right? They learned about intersectionality in the English class, they learned about collective identity in the sociology class. They're obviously learning about politics just from being in the world and watching TV. And so they're putting all this in conversation with each other and helping each other to understand these concepts that are directly connected to them, right? And their identities and their worlds. So Watson, Hippolito, Delgado say, new ideas and perspectives alone do not lead directly to changes in the material world. It takes action in the form of strategic behavior to advance social liberation. So as I mentioned before, oftentimes we can get so caught up in teaching about structures of oppression, right? Teaching this critical language, having our young people understand that everything isn't great everywhere and there are problems and you may or may not be able to have a hand in them, right? Because they've been around for a very long time. And then they kind of said, okay, so what do I do now, right? Like, what do I do with that information, right? That phrase, that idea that ignorance is bliss, right? Oftentimes, the more we know, the more we're just sad and we don't know what to do about it. We have less hope. So really important, we're also looking at the action piece, right? What do we then do? Great, they know ideas like intersectionality, institutional racism, institutional oppression, but how do they then sit with that and not be sad, right? How do they make change from that? So the sociology and activism class exposes students to theories of social change, right? Not just the idea that social change is a thing and they should be in it, but there are different and sometimes conflicting theories behind how to bring that about, right? So they read about Gantz's theory, they read about Hirsch's theories, they were exposed to this really specific language around consciousness raising, as I mentioned, collective identity, the role of storytelling. So even before just sort of throwing this project at them and saying, now go make change, right? Go do stuff. Take these ideas and make things different. But they were really critically looking at change movements, right? And ideas of change movements to figure out, what does change even look like, right? How does one bring that about? What does organization look like? How have organizations failed in the past? How do we make sure we don't fail in our organizing? And so again, they're reading these critical texts, reading scholarly texts. This picture comes from a student's annotations of an article about collective identity. And this happened about a week and a half after I saw them learning about Gans and Hirsch. And here we could see this particular student making connections between what had been learned in those theories and what she's seeing in this article. And so most of this language isn't on the page itself, but we can see some of that thought happening, right? And so she's reading about the subsequent waves of protest and is thinking, okay, spillover effect, that we learned about that a week and a half ago. She's talking about collective empowerment, how collective identities can affect how an issue is seen. Bringing in Gans's polarization theory, right? So making sense of these ideas. And what I found, the reason I took this photo is because, again, I think it's really sort of easy to say you're teaching for social justice, right? And say you're teaching critical language and that you're teaching critical ideas. But harder to show how students are receiving that or making sense of that, right? And here's just sort of some evidence of that being received, right? Of the complex thinking that's coming from that exposure to the ideas. And it sort of refutes that argument that this stuff is too sophisticated for high school students, right? Or this is too difficult, it's too challenging, it's too complex. It's not, right? Because they are making sense of this. They also studied change movements, right? And so here they're looking at the Fees Must Fall movement in South Africa, where students were arguing that it was too expensive to go to school, right? And they analyzed this movement through the lens of the theories they learned, right? So some of the questions they were asked were, how would you present this data to South African students to show that progress has been made, right? That change has been made. Why are the students demanding these things? How would South African students respond to some of these theories, right? So they're really engaging critically with the theories and then looking at those movements. Again, this is before they even constructed their own social change movements, right? Really getting that background first. So I had, as I mentioned, I interviewed some of the students who were in the 12th grade classes to figure out, again, how they're receiving this, right? How is this sort of making sense to them? How are they sitting with these ideas? Is it just a means to an end? Is it just for a grade? And so one student, Leigh, who's a senior, said, I'm really passionate about social justice and activism. So maybe being a lawyer might be a good fit, but I'm still learning, right? So it's already trying to figure out, how do I put these ideas into action? What do I do with this? Okay, maybe if I'm a lawyer, I can make some change. And I asked, have you always been passionate about social justice and activism? Which I think is important because we can also, if we're working in areas with students who are already entering as activists, right? There's one student I spoke to who's, whose mother marched with Al Sharpton, who grew up in an activist family. She was born an activist. And so for her to say things like this, one could just say, well, that wasn't the school though, right? You were already like that. So Yami said, no, not really. I think that really came about in high school when I started getting exposed to different issues. And then she said that through social media, through Twitter and Facebook, I try to engage my peers in actually being more woke about the world. I think starting the conversation, even though we don't know exactly how to conclude it, is a great start, right? So this tells me that she wasn't born an activist, right? This actually came about through what she learned in school, and that she's already thinking about ways to try to bring other people on board, right? To develop critical consciousness, not just in herself, but in others through social media. And then also this understanding that it's not overnight, right? She's not like, okay, now I was not woke and now I am, and then I will make other people be woke. But there's something about sort of wrestling with, I don't know how this ends. I don't know, the conclusion, but I know that I can start by at least spreading these ideas, right? Spreading this awareness. So they had these change projects, the 12th graders. Again, that was a part of their graduation requirement. And what they were asked to do was first identify an issue, and then research the issue. Research who had already tried to address or mitigate this issue. How did they do that? Then again, using their understandings of these change theories, they were asked to evaluate how effective past movements to mitigate this issue were. They read academic articles about these issues, less academic articles, and created a lit review. So I think their midterm included an annotated bibliography and a lit review, right? Happened to be year 12th grade. It's a rigorous class. And then after that, they had to then propose what they wanted to do about the issue, right? through the lens of the theory. So they have to really justify why this, right? Why fundraising, why a blog, why having a speaker come, why having a workshop, like, how will this help with this issue? And then they implemented whatever this project was. It was a workshop, a talk, an event, a video. Then they had to evaluate if it was effective, right? Was what you did effective? In what way was it effective? How may it have been more successful? And then they presented this in front of a panel of judges who were all faculty members at the school for a grade and then also for feedback. So that was all spring semester. I spoke to Sheila after she had completed her project. And I asked her how she experienced that, what that was like for her. She said, for once, I was told to find something I'm passionate about and run with it. So I did my research. First, I had to acknowledge, although it may kill me, that I can't call up all the federal governments of each of these countries and list my complaints and see it happen. It's not going to happen. But the idea that if I can raise money because I'm being a fundraiser and also teaching little kids, had it not been for that class, I would have been passive in my passion for it, right? So here she was acknowledging this is not overnight, right? it's not an easy solution. I get that, right? Especially after doing all that research, it's like you're the first person to try to end poverty, right? Or the first person to try to bring about literacy in small villages. But she also has this sense of hope and empowerment, but I can do something. I can raise money, I can teach people, and connecting to her passions, right? That she wasn't asked to do something that was distant from who she was, but she could combine them. And then Milo actually did his project about diabetes and exposing people, to the risks, to preventative measures, what people can do. And he said, so I have like a pre-survey that I'll be giving out to people, and I'll give a lesson and then see if more people get the post-survey correct, which is exactly like the pre-survey. If they get them correct towards the end of class, it'll show I actually taught something. But doing out an exit ticket won't really help at all. But if I compare like your previous, like your final answer, it'll show the changes. Like I actually taught you something. You actually took something away. And so here Milo's talking about, again, not just I did this thing, I'm done, right? Like I'm going to save the world because I had one workshop. But he's aware that there are ways that you need to measure that, right? That evaluation of your own projects, of your actions toward change are important, right? That you have to sit and think, what am I doing? How am I doing it? Why is it effective? And so you and him saying, well, an exit ticket isn't enough because I won't know what they knew beforehand, right? So he had, based on all of that research, based on the project, his understanding, I had to figure out what are they coming in with? What are they leaving with? And then I can know if I was effective and how. So what does this mean for educators? First of all, that we must expose students, and again, depending on the level they're at, there are different ways, instructions for how we do that, to critical language, right? If young people don't understand the difference between racist and racial, you can't really have those conversations, right? You can't even begin to have conversations about race and equity because they're already afraid that it's being racist to be in the conversations, right? So exposure to that language, exposure to critical theories, right? That there's a foundation for these ideas. They're not coming out of nowhere. There's a backing for it, right? And then that theory helps us to understand things, right? We can name things. That's what Freire says about critical consciousness, right? It's about naming the world. If you can't name it, how can you talk about it and how can you change it? Exposure to counter narratives, right? Some of the texts, I mentioned that they read Top Dog, Underdog. If you've read it or seen the play, has anyone seen the play or read Top Dog, Underdog? It's very explicit. So I walked into class and they were doing, you call it a table read, right? Everyone was taking up parts and reading the text out loud. And I had these cringe moments where I was like, oh, you just said, and the students didn't giggle. They weren't laughing, they weren't smiling, they weren't uncomfortable. I was the only one who was uncomfortable because they had already been established an environment of maturity in this room, right? And so the teacher already said, yes, these words will come up. But they'd already been exposed to the feminist theories, the language of feminist theory, language of queer theory. And so when these moments came up, they're talking about like phallocentrism, and they're talking about it from a sophisticated point of view, and weren't getting the giggles. And therefore, we're able to have this conversation. So how do we bring in texts that can typically be marginalized, that aren't readily available on the internet all the time, right? That haven't always been taught. It takes more work, right? This teacher had to create his own curriculum for everything he taught because it doesn't exist already. But how does that push us to know our students better, right? To tailor what we're teaching to who's in the room, and also to bring about this critical dialogue, right? The dialogic inquiry, right? The students were asking questions of the text, of themselves, of each other. They weren't afraid to say, well, where did you see that, or to say, I disagree because, and have those conversations. And then, of course, exposure to theories and structures of change, right? Not just saying, stuff is bad, go change it, right? You're the hope that we wish to see in the world. The youth are the vision of the future. But to really expose them to how do we do that, right? So they don't feel defeated and hopeless. And some lingering questions I have are, first of all, and so this is a term that my mind came up with, but how does schoolifying social activism, impact what activism is, right? Can it be less liberating, less empowering when there's a grade attached to it, right? When you have to create an activism project to graduate, can that in some ways limit your passion for it, right? Can that just make it school and not something that you're really invested in, right? What does it mean to get a grade on that? How might these classroom practices need to shift when teaching students who do not identify as marginalized or oppressed, right? So oftentimes we do this work around activism, critical consciousness, social justice with people who sort of are most identified as underrepresented or marginalized or oppressed. And then everyone else gets away with just not having to know this stuff, right? Which is unfair, because we all need to be involved in this project, right? I was at a talk recently at Union Theological Seminary where Angela Davis said she rejects the term allyship. She was like, I don't believe in allyship because if we're talking about change and transformation, like that's everyone. Everyone needs, it's not for certain people, everyone needs to be on board. So you're not an ally, you're a part of this. And so how do we have these conversations in spaces where, the majority of the students may not identify as marginalized or oppressed? They may not see themselves in this work, and they may not see how it directly impacts them. And then how can teachers implement these critical practices in traditional school spaces, right? So as I mentioned, the schools that I was in, and specifically the school that I talked about here, they're charter schools who are dedicated to this mission, right? They built into their curriculum social change and activism. At one point, I think it was on a weekend too, but maybe on a weekday, the principal of this school took all the faculty to go see I'm Not Your Negro, it's a film about James Baldwin, at the movie theater, right? So to think about the school where that's just normal, right? This is a part of the process where you walk through the hallways and you see this language on the boards. What does this look like in a school that doesn't have that built into its structure, right? Where the administration isn't taking everyone to go talk about James Baldwin. What can teachers do? And I'll stop here so that we can talk and you all can ask questions. Does that work?
One thing that seems to be understood that you didn't mention, which I think is really outstanding, is that you're talking to students of color in an urban setting, and you're not approaching them from a deficit perspective. And that's really unusual, unfortunately, as far as my experience has been. And I think that's a really important point.
That is a really good point. Yes, thank you.
Yes, hi. Did you notice any, I know you said you were only involved in the project within 12th grade, right? But that you observed 9th grade classes and things like that. What were some of the biggest differences that you noticed? And also, did you notice any like disengagement with the material?
Great question. So it's hard to say because there's one specific group of 10th grade students that I met with who were, I think we spoke for 2 hours in the stairwell of the school one day because they were so excited to talk about this stuff. They recently learned about institutional racism and really just eager to talk about it and tell me everything they knew about it. And so in some ways, that group that I spoke to was on a similar level to 11th to 12th grade students in terms of the language they had, sort of their passion for this work. But in terms of watching in class what they were talking about, it was not at that same level of sort of criticality. And so what I saw in 9th and 10th grade was building in those structures for just academic writing, critical conversations, Socratic seminars. One of the classes, a writing class that I observed where they're having a Socratic seminar, I think the issue they talked about was, do pets have rights? Which is still, I mean, it's a fascinating conversation, right? It's not important, it's not superficial, right? And so thinking about ethics and morality and at what point does someone have rights? You have to be human to have rights, right? What are human rights? But I noticed that it was a less critical conversation compared to what I saw in 11th and 12th grade. And that was one of the talks where they were like, I agree, and I agree, and I agree. And so they didn't quite seem ready to really sort of be in that sort of tense space of, I don't actually agree with you. And so I think that's the biggest difference I saw, is just the level of engagement and then the types of topics. But those structures were kind of being built in at that point. In terms of disengagement, I didn't see anyone disengage in the literature classes, but I did see, when I spoke to some people especially at the beginning of the year in the sociology and activism course, there are some people who were really trying to solve hunger. They went to like go out into the community and get the vote out. And then there are people who wanted to start a homework help club, right? Sort of a little more local, right? And like low level, like less about like, let's get out in the street and protest. One person actually had a whole event at the school where she brought in local politicians and professors and poets who are activists to talk about gentrification, right, specifically in the community. It's an urban community, invited everyone, so all the middle school students, we had a community member. It was a huge event that I can't imagine I would be able to pull off an event like this. And a 17-year-old did that. And so it ranged from that to people who were like, and then we met once and did homework together, right? And wasn't really connecting it to sort of issues of race or class equity. It was just some people need help with homework. And so I would say that's less disengagement and more like they just weren't sort of there, right? They weren't trying to, march on the streets or do really complex sort of, or come up with complex strategies to address issues. And some of them were just trying to get the grade, right? And that's sort of going back to what it means to do this work to get the grade, right? It's like, I guess I had to do something. We'll just pick up some bottles in the park and say we, cleaned up the park, right? And so that's I would say that's not critical consciousness, right? But it's outreach, right? And it's engagement and it's being involved in your community. So it's something, but not that same level, right? And I did notice in some of the English classes, as I said, I was trying to keep up with all the reading. These are really long books. Has anyone read White Teeth by Zadie Smith? Mm-hmm. It took me, I think, 2 months to read it. It's wonderful and really long, and I read it in, I think, 3 weeks. So as I was trying to catch up with these books, I would talk to the students, say, like, how are you? What do you think of this chapter? And there was one student who sort of put her head down. She was like, oh, I didn't really make it past part 1. And I'm like, oh, but what about the section about hair? When she goes to the hair salon, that's so important. And she's like, I hear the book is great, and the conversations in the class tell me I should read it. I got a lot going on. And so, and again, I wouldn't need to find that as disengagement, but just, it's still school and it's still a lot of work. And so while I was really excited about certain things, some of the students were just sort of like skimming, to get through class. And I didn't have the time or as much of the inclination to really dig into some of the text. It's a really good point and question. Thank you. Hi.
I'd like to hear more about your thoughts based on your experience in the classroom on that last more questions. Like, how would this look in a traditional schooling system?
So how does it look for me, or how do I think it could look in an ideal?
It could look, but still within the constraints of a regular public, 9-12 school.
Absolutely. So I think one thing I would say is the sociology and activism class, while I thought it was wonderful, I think in some ways it's less realistic to really make a required course, right? There's so much work involved, right? If you looked at some of those requirements, that wasn't even everything. That was just a smattering of what they were asked to do. It's a lot of work, and I think it might be unrealistic to have every student do that in sort of regular mainstream schools. But in terms of the work that we did in the English class, I think that is very doable, right? At the end of the day, they're still decoding language, right? They're still looking at literary devices. They're still structuring academic pieces, right? All those essays had a claim. They were reading literature and annotating, asking questions, involved in discussion. All those students were ready for the AP test. I think most of them took the AP test. And this is, I don't want to say the state required test, right? They took that, they did well. And so while this work was specific to them and their identities and their communities in terms of the activism and the language, they were very prepared for those state exams, right? Most of the students at the school applied to, Ivy League schools, right? And got into them. And so the academic rigor was there, but then there was also this really important component of being about you, right? And being about change, your homes, your communities, your identities. And so I think schools should be doing this in mainstream setting. As I was watching, I was like, as long as my principals were on board, I could do this, right? And that to me was the most empowering, was that it didn't seem, unlike the sociology class, which again is so specific, very doable, right? I think it means that we have to take a look at what are the texts we're teaching and how are we teaching them? Because some of those classes taught very traditional texts, right? But it's the how, right? What are you doing with it? What are the students doing with it? What supplemental materials are you adding to it? I think it really has to be a buy-in on the part of the whole school, though. So if one class is talking about race and all the other classes are not, there's that one class that's critical and rigorous and difficult and tense and uncomfortable, and everyone else gets to sort of hang out, right? And so it has to be across the board. Otherwise, that teacher has way too much pressure on them, right? If it's even allowed by the administration, right? And if it's not, then you have the whole like shut the blinds, close the door, don't tell anyone we're talking about this. That's unfair for teachers to have to teach that, right? You shouldn't have to be teaching for change subversively. I mean, in my ideal world, this is what schools would be doing sort of generally, right?
I think along those lines, my focus is math and mathematician, so I'm always sensitive to what's going on in mathematics teaching and teaching math and social justice, that kind of thing. So I appreciate hearing about it from stuff. But thinking about that, how might, and this goes to the last question, integrate instead of having them isolated. And so my question to you would be, in your research, was there any evidence that you observed, or could you make any inferences about whether the students who were in this class, whether that spilled over into other content like that?
That's such a great question. So I'll say, and I should repeat this for those who are listening on the internet, the question is, what does this work look like in other content areas? For example, STEM and math, was there sort of a correlation or an integration between them? It depends on the school. So one of the schools I observed, they had a humanities class, so instead of separating social studies or government and then English, that was all one class. And so they were, their writing skills were built through writing letters to politicians, right? And so they're learning about government, they're learning about economics, they're learning about writing, literature, different forms of writing, all sort of within this one class. And in the school that I described here, the sociology and activism class, a teacher was also the economics teacher. I thought that was a big shift, right? And so when I went into class, I was like, what is this gonna look like? Because this seems like an entirely different class. There was so much overlap. And then oftentimes I would notice in classes observing students or in interviews, we'd be talking about, racial inequity, and they're citing something from econ, right? Like, oh, well, that was like in the econ, and I'm not an economics person, so I can't keep the language, but they were using really specific language, like the cost benefit analysis, whatever the language was, in talking about literature, right? In talking about their activism projects. So I didn't specifically go into the math classes, but I imagine because the school was so devoted to that mission, they wanted everything really to be about not only how do we change the world, but how do our young people go out into the world in positions where they can do that. And so they talked a lot about coding. They made all the students learn to code, to the point where one day I was watching them code. I was trying to figure out how they did this. They were creating things with numbers, which I guess is what coding is. And one student I heard complaining, she's like, oh, we did this already. Like, I know how to do this. Why am I learning to code again, right? It was almost like they were so hit over the head with how to be super successful as a professional, as an academic, as an activist, right? As a human, that they were a little bit over it. Like, why are you telling me this? I got this. So yes, there was a lot of integration. I saw more than anything else in the assemblies they had and in their advisory classes, where a lot of things from sort of the sociology course, the English course, and math and econ were really pulled together. But they did that in science, right? In their math classes as well, there was definitely a focus on how are you learning these things for your future, right? So going down to the equations, they tried to the extent that they could, because there's a lot, right? They were doing calculus and other things that I don't understand that well. But really sort of trying to integrate as much as they could so that everyone was on the same page, right? So the math teacher was one of the judges on the sociology and activism course, right? And the science teacher was there for their poetry slams, judging. And so they really sort of tried to bring everyone in so that it was not siloed. That was helpful. Hi. Yes.
Oh, okay. So this was very interesting. I was wondering, since these were charter schools, right? Can you talk a little bit more about the demographics and we all know this whole filtering process that happens with charter schools, and how that may have affected the results that you saw, and how that might also affect buy-in into the whole process together?
Wonderful question. Thank you. So to answer that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the other school I didn't talk as much about. And the reason I didn't talk as much about this other school is because it was in a different city, but outside of that, the demographics were very similar. And yet what I saw in terms of that rigor, right, the academic rigor, were very different. hence why we didn't talk about them today. So I had those same questions, right? And I kept, every week I'd go home and think and type my notes and think, how come at this one school they're super ready for the AP and they're talking about words I've never even heard in my life, like they're teaching me things, and then I'm at this other school and they're still trying to write a thesis in 12th grade, like really trying to write a thesis. And I go back to the research team and I'm like, well, what am I missing here? Like, what are the filtering systems? Are these just different students? And so we went through sort of we're looking at the racial demographics, very similar. One difference is that the school that I described here had more Muslim students, Black Muslim students, right? So, and more of an immigrant population, whereas the other school was more of an African American population. And I noticed that in some of the ways they had conversations about immigration at the other school, or when they talked about Islam, it was a lot of more gaps, right, in understanding. But outside of that, really, and then at one point I was like, well, maybe they just have more family support. But then because they didn't talk as much at the school sort of about home life. It wasn't really at the forefront of what they were learning or how they were learning. But then when I'd hear their side conversations, very similar, a lot of single parent homes, students who weren't as in contact with families, who were living with extended family members, who were displaced, who were coming from really far away to go to school. And so when all was said and done, very similar populations, it really came down to what was focused on in school. And so at the other school, the students weren't as academically prepared, weren't applying to four-year schools. Most of them were applying to two-year schools, to local schools. The focus there was a lot on healing, right? It was a lot about tell your story. The senior project at that school was about telling your story. They spent the year working through drafts and drafts of who are you? How did you come to be this person? What have you learned? And so they end senior year with standing in front of the entire school and telling these really personal stories. Really emotional. Family, sometimes their family would show up. Everyone's crying by the time they leave. And so that really was the focus of the school, was on that individual piece, talk about your home life. A lot of sort of pushing the curriculum aside sometimes to deal with what's happening in that moment, right? I see your face, let's deal with that. We'll do this tomorrow. And so in some ways, at the risk of that academic rigor, the focus was sort of on the self. And I think that's sort of how we see those stark differences. In terms of the selection of the schools, it was lottery-based. I know one of the schools, a lot of it was family. If you have other family members who are here, if you have siblings, when keep the family together, so you got a priority. But outside of that, there weren't really ways to have a priority. It was lottery-based. And I did not see any students kicked out of either of the schools. Again, though, I saw the 12th. I really was looking at 11th and 12th grade at both the schools. But in my time there, I did not see anyone pushed out or kicked out or expelled or, asked not to come back.
What about economically? Like, are they comparable?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So, first of all, I find it pretty impressive that they were exposed to such a rigorous theories and theory. I was introduced much later, like I would say in my master's degree, and the struggle I faced was interacting with other people, like my family, relatives, and friends who are not exposed to this thing, and talking about these issues with them. Right. So did you find those students, how did they interact with their family people, the other neighborhood friends and all?
That's a wonderful question. So for those tuned in online, the question is, how do these young people interact with those who weren't learning these things, right? Who didn't necessarily have that language or that sort of consciousness? That was one of the interview questions that I asked, because I was really curious about that. And it really varied from student to student. Again, there's that one student who grew up, who was born an activist. She talks, it's what she does, right? I think she was sitting on like the youth mayoral board of the city. Like this is her life, was talking about stuff. She was getting her friends to be involved in activism in the city. Some of the students who I asked said that they do not talk about these things at home, right? They're like, no, really just in school. It's the only time they have these conversations. Not with their family members, not with siblings, not online. Yami, whose selection of an interview we saw, she is someone who chooses to, through social media, try to spread those ideas, right? But she also mentioned that it gets tiring. She's like, it's exhausting. I'll go back and forth with someone for hours and hours. And at a certain point, she's like, I need to sort of scale back and not try to be that person. But she did actively try to sort of, I don't want to say shut people down, but raise consciousness with her friends, right? Even her peers in school sometimes. right, who weren't really there, who maybe were more disengaged, and then even with strangers online. And so for the most part, students didn't really talk about these things outside of those who were their friends in school, or outside of the internet. And one more thing I'll add with that particular student, when I asked her, because going back to demographics, so most of these students, 99% students of color, mostly Black students, live in communities of color. So a lot of them don't have a lot of interaction with people who are not people of color. And so one question I asked her, I was like, all right, you're going to college next year, you're like very into activism, you talk about these ideas, how are you feeling about being at a college, maybe in a dorm or a class where like not everyone learns the way you did? And she started crying. And it turned out that was like her worst fear. She was like, that actually is the one thing that scares me. She's a very strong, like courageous person. She's like, that's one thing that scares me is she's like, I've always been around like Black people. She's like, I don't know what it will be like to be, because she plans and is going to, she plans to go to a predominantly white institution. She was like, I know I'm going to, encounter people who don't think this way, who don't have these ideas, who don't look like me, and I don't know what I'll do. Sorry, that was kind of a sad, but she's there and she's happy and she likes it. She's doing well. She's thriving.
I don't know if it's sad, but do you think about that as one of your questions of how these schools might continue to advance what they're doing? Because there is something in creating this environment that is kind of a safe space, right? But are you also preparing students to be leaders in environments that are, I don't even think the opposite is unsafe, but are where the onus would be on them to listen and to create those spaces as well. It's an interesting piece of it, I think, of how you help people transition into other environments.
And I think what's so hard about that is how do you do that in a way that's not weird, right? If you can't, right, you can't import white people one day into class and be like, now interact and see what it's like. Like how do you do that, right? And I did actually see one of the schools try to do that because the students were going on a field trip that did have diverse students there. So students were coming from more affluent communities, urban communities. And then there was a teacher who did a whole lesson on how do you interact in this diverse setting. And it didn't go well. The students really shut down through the whole lesson, and then when I spoke to them afterwards, they kind of felt like they're being prepared to encounter just a whole group of wild racists. And it made them shut down. And I went on the trip with them the next day, and they didn't speak up for themselves. They completely shut down. They wanted no part of it because they having no idea who these students were. And some of those students, I spoke to them, they were really nice and like really sort of wanting to engage, and they just walked in being prepared for these people are going to be awful, because that's what I learned yesterday. And so that's why I don't know what a great way is to prepare young people.
But also similarly for them to talk to their peers in a way that isn't like trying to convince them, but is a way where they can actively, with people who are not in the classes they're in. Right. How do you have conversations with people who are sensibly like you, but who you're entering a whole other way of speaking into the conversation. Right.
And then how do you protect yourself within that, right? How do you make sure that you're feeling? I had this is separate research, but I was speaking to a group of 12th grade students the other day about this stuff, right? About how they develop critical consciousness and what they do, and they all sort of mentioned going through their angry phase, right? And they're like, we're past it now, so we get it, it happened, but it's a phase. They said it's necessary. And I asked them, well, now that you know it was a thing you were going through and you're sort of past it, what is one to do when someone's in that, right? And one of the things someone said, just don't make me feel weird about it. Like maybe you don't agree, maybe I'm like a little angry, but don't make me feel like I'm an outcast or I'm strange. Don't sort of push me to the side and act like I'm saying crazy things. And so yes, how do we have those conversations that people just feel supported in whatever it is that they're going through in that moment, right? That's a great question. Thank you. There was a question back here. Yes.
It was about, I guess, the teachers. Like, what kind of, I don't know if I want to say, like, you said the principal to WC, I'm not sure Negro, but do they have, like, what kind of, like, professional development or credentials, like, to be able to, like, develop curriculum? Do they have?
Good question. They have really rigorous professional development. I was there for some of the days this summer. They don't really have a summer. I think they have 3 or 4 weeks, but they were in professional development all summer. And that's also, and there are other questions we can get into at another time about credentials, and some people are advocating for let's get rid of let's let schools credential our teachers. But no, so they have a lot of personal development. They brought me in, to give a talk on critical consciousness. They bring in speakers a lot, but they also and they do it in-house for the most part. So they also go to conferences, but they do a lot of in-house things where those who either were teachers or now administrators in the district or were students will come back and have these conversations with them so that they're prepared. Another thing I will say is that most of the teachers at the school were white teachers. I think there were 3 or 4 teachers who weren't. So one of the English teachers is a woman of color who's from the city that they're from. And for some of the students, when I asked them about it, they didn't really care at all, right? They're like, I don't know, she's a great teacher, she's a great teacher. Some of their favorite teachers were their white teachers. However, some of the students had, I don't want to say anger, there was frustration around it, right? And it was one of the first things they say to me is, all the teachers are white, this is crazy. How come no one looks like me? Some students who specifically wanted to go to, historically Black colleges because they wanted to have teachers who looked like them, right? They were used to being around people who looked like them, but they wanted to. One student said, like, how are you gonna come and talk to me about my identities and my community and you don't even look like me, right? A lot of teachers also were not from the city. They were from the South or the Midwest or other places. And so there's definitely some sort of frustration. And going back to your question, some disengagement just because of that, right? Like, I get what you're talking about and it seems important, but I don't really believe you just because of what you look like. And so a lot of the professional development too was around how do you connect to students who see that distance, who don't look like you, and so that it's not sort of returns to that deficit language, right? So they don't feel like you're treating them like, oh, these like poor, impoverished kids who can't stand on their own. And so they do a lot of work around that to try to mitigate that or avoid it. That's a great question. How are we doing on time? 10 more minutes. Wonderful. I have, if I may take a moment, I have a question that I wanted to ask you all dealing with this idea of objectivity. So this image comes from the sociology and activism course, where the students were asked to research the Egyptian revolution and ISIS as movements, right? They were asked to see these as movements, which is interesting, to research them and then answer this question: what movement, Egyptian revolution or ISIS, is more justifiable and why? Right, already rigorous assignment. As they were asked to do that at home, actually, and then come in prepared to discuss it. What I found interesting was this note at the bottom. It says, be sure you're remaining objective and basing your response in social change theory. And of course, I get it, right? We have to ask our students to be objective so that they're not just giving opinions, right? I think, without the evidence, without the quotes, without founding it, right, or grounding it in something. But I also wonder a lot about this ask, right, for someone to be objective, especially when you're dealing with social issues. And it doesn't mean that, in math you can also be objective, but I really it's a word that's come up a lot for me here at the GSE this semester. When we're speaking about, how do you talk about social issues in class? I've heard a lot of, as long as the teacher's objective, remains objective, then we can have this conversation. As long as the students are objective, we can have this conversation. I just wonder, firstly, is that possible, right? Is objectivity a thing that can happen in a classroom space, either on the part of the teacher or the students, when you're dealing with social issues, when you're dealing with culture, when you're dealing with identity? And is that a goal that we should be aspiring to? Should we be sort of reaching towards objectivity? So those are 2 questions that I'd like us to sort of work through for a moment.
I think it's interesting, given all the language they were talking about in teaching and taking on all these critical perspectives, that they're still kind of holding this objectivity. So to me, there's other options. You can talk about intersubjectivity. You can talk about strong subjectivity. There's work in standpoint theory, feminist theory that might take these on. You could that could be another language you can give them to work on, and not have to disconnect personally from it, because to me, disconnecting personally from it takes away some of the ways in which you connect to things. And I think we have ways of doing that. And I also think that objectivity has been struck down enough to have that language in those perspectives. And so, and they don't require me kind of separating from whatever I'm studying and actually realize when you try to do that, you're still connected. You just try to realize it. So
yeah, layers. of subjectivity and connectedness and that exposure. I like that.
Yeah, I mean, the questions themselves are not objective, right? They come from a place. So, you know, I think there are different sets of criteria we can talk about, right? I mean, there's supporting you as you're doing with arguments and evidence, not being inflammatory. I mean, there's so just going off and with a perspective without sort of reasoning through it seems something you ought to guard against, right?
Right.
But to sort of promote a fiction that somehow there are these objective truths, and I mean, they've been challenging hard sciences, right? So to think about in these areas that somehow we're going to have these objective truths seems crazy. You know, I mean, it's a fallacy that you promote. So what is it that we're really asking for? And I do think there are certain things that, you know, I find objectionable going to happen in classrooms or read about, you know, but it's not because there's a perspective that's offered and it's driving it, but it's because you're not hearing other people, you're making assumptions that are your assumptions without understanding something else's. The kinds of things we're trying to raise.
Right. Even how we read data, right, is not objective. You know, have you ever had someone take half a sentence in their paper and they're like, so to my point, I'm like, that was half the sentence. Where's the other half of the sentence?
I think that gets away from context matters as a human being, and I never did this. I came into my PhD program saying, well, how do I say objective on my research? And then I realized that there is no such thing as objectivity, even in interpretation of the law. I think that a better way to get at is to help them to be more evidence-based and not just feelings, more facts and evidence than feelings and how I see the world. It is more a failure to say, well, remember your positionality, remember your identities when writing this, and be aware of the evidence that you're pulling together based on the multiple layers of who you are. I love that. I would love to rework that with that language, right, and incorporate in there as well. Thank you.
Yeah, and to build on that and to be willing to share your subjectivity. What informs your position, and why do you have these opinions? What are they based on? Yeah, we're all human beings. We all come from a place of who we are, what makes us.
I do wonder if maybe things like that are what might be discouraging some students from engaging in these crises outside of the classroom. Because like it sounds like from what everyone's saying that's not, if someone is like dedicated to social activism, it's not because they have an objective standpoint that like this should be happening. It's because they feel somehow that this is very important and necessary. So I wonder if maybe like that's contributing to this like othering of like, well, there's social justice that happens for me, and then there's social justice that happens for school.
Right, that separation, right? The feelings and the objectivity. That's such a good point. Thank you. Other thoughts on objectivity as we talk about social issues, especially as a school community, right? And again, this has come up a lot in the past few weeks, right? Just as long as the teacher is objective. And I always read these comments like, am I being, is that possible, right? How does that, especially on a teacher, from the teacher perspective, like how do you sort of keep yourself out?
My feeling when we wonder if the teacher is objective isn't whether the teacher is staring at things from some viewpoint on either end of the devices, but whether they're willing to accept or consider other students' points of view if those differ from their own. And to be honest, it's a concern that I have in the GSE that there certainly are points of view that we want our students to adopt.
Huh. And how does that come across? Is that in the language we use? Is it in the questions we ask? How does a student receive, oh, this is what you want me to think? Because we don't say that, right? We don't ever say, like, you must learn this.
Well, we want students to think, I'll say two things, that there are systemic inequities that have a harmful effect on oppressed individuals. And this is a primary reason that there's some achievement gaps, whatever you want to call them. and that any difference between achievement between two groups of people is due primarily to their inequities rather than to differences in culture.
Right.
So these are two things where it seems that if you emerge from the GSC without having acquired and against these beliefs, we would view ourselves as failures.
Powerful. Yeah, I don't want to, I'm trying to remain objective by not nodding or shaking my head. I appreciate what you said. I might have thoughts about it. Thank you for that. No, that's really important. I think a really great place, for us to go about our day and really thinking about what are we aiming for, right? Is it to have everyone think the way we do? What are the moments where we don't think that's what we're doing and it's what we're doing, right? Either through nodding or shaking, or I know sometimes my face does something when someone says something that I think, when they're like bootstraps, just to pull yourself, and I'm like, oh, that's a good idea. So yeah, how do we convey those things, right? And how do we have those conversations and sort of work towards, whatever it is we individually want to work towards as educators and community members. Are there any lingering questions for? Yes.
It's not a question, but I would think that like after all of this that you have like taught students, like if I'm the teacher, the bottom line about objectivity aside, and I pose that question, like I would want after all of this like critical work that I've done with my students, for a student to look at me and say justifiable to whom?
Right.
Before they even go home to do anything, to
right.
be like this question that you're asking me before I start reading these things, like what are you asking me? Like that would be like the pinnacle of assessment to me.
What do you mean by justifiable, right? Who am I in this scenario? And based on that, absolutely. Right. What is my positionality in that scenario? Then I'll give you an answer. Beautiful. Thank you for that. Sweet. Thank you so much, everyone.